proyectos como Brutal Legend y el actual Broken Age. Es un veterano de la industria, está haciendo juegos, trabajando en juegos hace más de 18 años y está teniendo un rol como cada vez más protagónico dentro de Double Fine. Así que los dejo con Di Petit.
Hola! Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me here. All right, great. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lee Petty, and I work at Double Fine, as just said. And since I've been at Double Fine, I've been an art director and a project lead. I was art director of Brutal Legend and project lead of a little game called Stacking. And I'm currently the art director on our big Kickstarter game, Broken Age. When I came to Double Fine, we were making one big game at a time, led by Tim Schafer, which was awesome. And in the first 9 years of Double Fine's life, we managed to ship 2 games. We shipped Psychonauts and Brutal Legend. But around 2009, we changed the way that we were making games. And instead of making just one big game at a time, we started making multiple smaller titles. And 13 years into our life, we've now shipped 13 games. So it's quite a huge increase in the amount of games that we make from 2009 to 2013. And because we're making so many new games, we need a process by which we can develop new ideas. And that process, invented by Tim, is the Amnesia Fortnight process, is what we call it. And that's a 2-week game jam where our goal is to make a new idea and what we call a complete experience in 2 weeks. So it's not really just a mechanical prototype or just testing gameplay systems. We really want an idea of what the game looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, and what it plays like in 2 weeks. So it's because of that process that I really had to adapt the way I art-directed games. Because when you're working on a game for multiple years, you approach it a certain way. But when you have 2 weeks to make a game, and you're trying to discover the core of what that look is, you have to change the way you do that. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about my approach for rapidly creating a new look for a game, a new game. And I think this approach is good for prototypes, and it's also good for small teams. So if you're a small indie team and you want to take things into full production, I think this process would work well for you. But I do want to point out that this process is just the start for a game. Like all game jams, the actual process of building the full game means that there's a lot more research and iteration to do. But today, we're just going to talk about the start. So the 2 games I'm going to use to demonstrate these ideas are 2 games that I led. One is Stacking, and the other one was a prototype created last year called Autonomous. And these games I chose because they were both created in a 2-week period. And I think during that 2-week period, we did manage to capture the essence of what the games looked and felt like. And we developed those with a team of about 10 to 12 people. Nowadays, most of our full production teams are about 8 to 15 people, so that's about average for us. So a little more about each one of these games. Stacking is a game inspired by a Victorian world filled with living Russian stacking dolls. Those are the little dolls that nest in each other and they get from smaller to larger. And as a player, you control a small doll and you can stack into and take control of a doll that is one size larger than yourself. And each of these dolls has special abilities that you use to solve adventure game style puzzles. Now here's a few screenshots from the game. The first image here is of the main character Charlie and his family, which are these working class chimney sweeps set in this environment. And Charlie goes on all these adventures, not only to save his family, but as it turns out, to try and save children who are working in these kind of comically unfortunate Industrial Revolution style jobs. And here's an example of what you do as a player. You approach a doll one size larger than yourself, which highlights, and then you can jump into and take control over that doll. The second game I'm going to talk about is Autonomous. And it's a very different game. This game is a first-person action construction game, and it's set in this destroyed kind of retrofuturistic world, based a lot on 1980s science fiction and virtual reality. And in this, you are searching through this environment to find found objects and construct robots from these found objects, and you use these robots to fight other robots, of course, and discover energy. So here's a few screenshots from that. This is the world itself, and this is from the 2-week prototype. And right here it shows the player has found a bunch of pieces and put them into a construction grid, and this robot's ready to activate and follow its programming. And here's a screenshot of what combat might look like, where a friendly robot programmed by the player is attacking an enemy robot. All right, so those are the games, but how do you start? When you have just a 2-week period and maybe a team working with you, or maybe you're working by yourself, where do you start? And I just start simply. What inspires you as an artist? Why do you guys want to make games? And write just a simple list of those inspirations as it relates to this particular game. Like, what came into your head first when you first heard this idea? Is it your idea, or if you're working with someone else? If it's someone else's idea, I think you write a list of questions to them about that. What is this world? How do you see it? And you just write all those inspirations down, and hopefully there's something personal in these inspirations, and that your source of inspiration isn't just other video games, because that's what a lot of people do. And you want to make it original, right? So I'm going to share with you guys just a few of my inspirations for stacking. So first is just stop motion animation in general. When I started thinking about the type of world and how these dolls might move if they were living, stop motion animation seemed appropriate to me. And in particular, there is a group that makes a bunch of really surreal stop motion animation called the Brothers Quay. And the thing that's really cool about these is that they use a lot of found objects in their animation. So you can see in this image here, there's a desk built to the size of that creature, but on the top of the desk is like human-sized thimbles and thread spools and things along those lines. And it just created this sort of interesting metaphorical space to have human objects mixed into this stop-motion world. And that's something we did a lot in stacking. Secondly, I really love German expressionist film, which is this sort of strangely surreal, dramatic, black and white, silent movies. And it's very theatrical in its staging. You know, for the day, it was actually really low budget, and part of the way they dealt with that is just using stylization to really make a strong impact with very limited sets. And that's something that we try to adopt for the way we told stories in the game as well. And lastly is Charles Dickens and my grandfather. No relation. But Charles Dickens was a writer and wrote in the early Victorian era about a lot of things, but one of the things he wrote about was the classist society of England at the time, the difference between the poor and the rich. And in particular, his book, Oliver Twist, was a big influence for the main character and story of my game, where a boy is sort of put into these unfortunate circumstances and forced to work and do all these unfortunate things. And my grandfather, why this was personal for me is my grandfather was a poor immigrant to the United States with a very large family, and he was forced to work in a coal mine at age 10 just to make money so they could eat. And it was a story we grew up hearing in the family, and so I felt like I had a little bit of a personal connection to that, a little bit of inspiration for telling my version of that story. All right, so you have your list of inspirations, and the next thing I do is gather reference. And even on a short project, I'll spend at least a day to gather reference. And by going through and gathering reference, what that does is it gives you a chance to quickly find images and things out there that resonate with your ideas and maybe help focus you a bit. But there is a danger to just using Google image search. Everyone uses Google image search, and it's useful. I use it too, but if you use Google image search, your work and your inspirations are going to look like everyone else's. So don't use it that much. Read. And the problem, you could say, is with a short timeline, maybe you don't have time to read a lot of books on the subject, but at the very least, you have time to read Wikipedia or other online sources. And let me give you an example of why that makes a difference. So again, on stacking, when I went to gather my reference, of course, the first thing I looked for was images of Russian dolls. And if you look online, you will either see lots of images of stuff like this or stuff like this, right? Which is awesome in its own particular way, but I wasn't making a KISS stacking doll game. Maybe Brutal Legend would have done that. But so I wanted to understand a little bit more about where the painting tradition would come from. I wanted to have some more inspiration about what would the world look like. And in reading about Russian stacking dolls, or matryoshkas, as they're called, I found out they're really only about 100 years old, and actually the tradition of the painting and creating them comes from the Russian tradition of painting lacquer boxes. And the great thing about making this discovery for me was now I had a better picture of where that painting tradition come from, and I could see how they might render water, or how they might draw a tree, and use that as inspiration. Here's another shot that has some really great little clouds in it. And if you look at that and some of our in-game textures, here's an example. This is very different. We're using different colors, and it's our own content, but there's definitely an inspiration and influence of the way that they built some of those shapes of clouds and waves, and here's another example. And that carried over to the way we made the dolls as well. Here's a concept of a doll, and right next to it is what it looks like in game. And the exact line style is a little different, but there's definitely influence there with, if you look closely at how those things were painted. So it was a great discovery that I wouldn't have found just by finding cool images. All right, so now I like to organize my reference, and the reason why I find this important is usually what happens after you search for reference for a whole day, you wind up with just hundreds of thousands of images, and they're not in any particular priority. And if you're working with a team, you're like, hey dude, check this out, here's 1,000 images, this is what we're gonna do. It's not super useful. So I like to organize what I call style sheets. And style sheets are just a process of selection where you review your reference and pick the images or the ideas that most resonate with what you want to do. And it can be very broad or very specific. So here's some examples. When I was going to make Autonomous, I collected a bunch of these awesome 80s science fiction and virtual reality images. And even looking at this image, you can see that I noticed that there was a lot of these sort of almost sunglasses-shaped visors that the robots all had. You see it in RoboCop and Cylons. The early virtual reality headsets look that way. And even, here's some more. There's a Micronaut with a drill in the wrong place. I don't know where that's and some images from Black Hole, the movie. And they all had a lot of those same motifs. So when I went to actually do some drawings for Autonomous, I use that as influence. And again, we're trying to be influenced by these references and not imitate the reference, but carried over for me was the importance of that visor shape and that color there. And that actually factors into the gameplay mechanics. I can just hold the microphone. Yeah. You want me to hold the microphone? Is it good? All right. Sorry. I'm breaking up. All right. Thanks. And yeah, and here's how they sort of translated in game. And all of our robots in game are procedurally generated and assembled by the player or by the AI. So all the pieces get kind of mixed and matched, but you can see some of those shapes being influenced here. The visor played a prominent role. The color of that visor allowed the player to kind of understand what the robots were doing. Red, they were tracking the player, and green, they were sort of searching for the player, that type of thing. Here's another example of that same head on a different assembled robot body. Stacking, I'll show you a more specific example of style sheets. In stacking, we had a safari area on one of the ships that we were going to make, and but we didn't just want it to be a normal safari. We wanted to have it to be like a carnival show. And also like something the rich would play in their pastime, kind of a ridiculous game. And for me, that was croquet. I don't know if you guys know what croquet is, but it's this ridiculous game. And so we kind of took those ideas, and these are some of the early concepts we did, where we made like a giant croquet cannon, which would shoot animal stand-ups at a carnival. We took the idea of animal trophies, like the seats, and made a toilet out of an elephant trunk, which is not a common choice, but I think it worked well in stacking. And here's a screenshot of how some of those things translated to game. Okay, so concept art is something that a lot of artists love to do, and they'll spend the entire project making concept art if you let them. But concept art is great, but ultimately you're not shipping a painting, you're shipping a game, you're making a game. And the problem with concept art is that even the best concept art is static, right? And almost every game, not all, but almost every game is dynamic in some way. There's change over time. Either you moving through a space, or the lighting's changing over time, or things reacting to the player's actions. And this is true in both 2D and 3D games at differing amounts. But the important part is just to use concepts to provide an early overall direction, but don't stay in that mode too long. So in a 2-week period like that, I might spend 1 to 2 days doing these early concepts. So I'll show you some of them. When I worked on Autonomous, this is the very first image I did for Autonomous when I was trying to figure out what the world was going to be like. And for me, I try and just make little snapshots of what maybe some of the elements look like together as a starting point. So even though the game looks quite a bit different than this, even this early concept touched on some of the color palette I was interested in, and the idea of these lights stretching vertically into the world, which the player could use kind of as landmarks to move through the space. And just an early idea of what it might feel like to assemble a robot. The designs, of course, changed quite a bit, but this is the idea of picking up a found object and then using electricity to connect all these different robot parts. And that let us use robot parts that didn't have to match, so we could randomly mix and match them together because they were held together with electricity between them. Here's an early concept from stacking. Again, these aren't detailed, but this provides a sense of scale about what I wanted the space to be like, which was these big open interior spaces with a focus on architecture and maybe a hint at the palette, kind of an old-fashioned antique feel. Just another little area in stacking where it kind of opens up to the air and you can see the world that you can travel to beyond. So nothing too detailed, but enough to get things moving. Now, the thing that I really believe in strongly more than any of this is getting in the game as soon as possible. So I think there's importance and value in doing early concept exploration, but get in the game. You got to get in there and play it. You got to feel like what it is to move through that space, understand the camera, the dynamics. And this is true for both 2D and 3D games, even though I'm showing you mainly 3D examples. And let me give you an example. When we were working on Autonomous, this is what the game looked like 5 days into the prototype. And we all thought it'd be really cool to have a wireframe, hard edge on a lot of things. It looked great on paper. The problem was that it was already going to be kind of a noisy game because of all the energy and combat. And with this look, it really kind of was hard to push anything into the background or foreground. Your eyes would always kind of get stuck on these wireframes everywhere, and it didn't really feel satisfying to move through that space. So what we did by the end of the prototype was this. And we still have the wireframes everywhere, but the strength and color of that wireframe is modified by the lighting in game. And although it might be a little hard to tell in a static image, that allows you to kind of understand where you're moving in the world a lot more, and it creates a richer environment with a stronger sense of foreground and background. And that carried over to the player as well. You would move through light and dark spaces, and there's a lot going on. It was pretty easy to lose track of the player, so we added more glowing elements onto the player. And also, it's a little hard to see in this image here, but the hands, the gloves themselves are the only thing in the game that don't have wireframes on them. It's the only sort of organic shape, which separates the player a little bit from the rest of the game. So when I do additional concept art once we start, I do what I call paint overs. And paint overs are simply taking a screen capture or image from your game and quickly drawing on top of it in Photoshop or whatever your favorite digital painting program is. And the thing about these is they're not pretty. They're not supposed to be pretty. They're just about ideas, and you should do a lot of them. I don't spend more than 5 to 20 minutes on any of these paint overs. And they're just there to quickly explore ideas, and by drawing on top of a game screen, you're staying in context of the game. You're not going back to your original concept art. And so here's some examples. When we first started thinking about how the world in Autonomous was going to be built, the world is built procedurally. Every time you play the game, it's different. So we had to create chunks or modules that the world could place. And so I made this simple 3D model just to get a sense of like some of the shapes we like. And I just this very quick paint over. And it's not pretty, but it already demonstrates like a lot of the elements that the game needs. So for example, you can see that we were trying to keep the ground plane dark so that any pickups placed onto the ground plane with those blue glowing things would stand out. We're going to use yellow as a guideline color just to move the player through the space. And we're associating like pink and red with more energy sources that the player has to collect. And also, we wanted to sort of see how these pyramid or ziggurat shapes would kind of work for the environment. And here's an example a little bit later, maybe like a day later. And I just took a screen capture here, and I drew over that as well and added some notes. So this, again, isn't pretty, but it shows that with just a little paint over, you can kind of understand where you need to go with the game. And the importance of this paint over is it showed how much we needed to add enough atmosphere and use color to push that background back and call out those energy sources to the player. Here's a few from stacking. This is an early shot of stacking on the Steam. There's not much detail added. But the colors weren't really harmonizing for me at this point, and I just did a simple paint over. You add a little bit of color. The colors feel more satisfying. The player has a better sense of depth because we've got something at the doll's height kind of on the walls going all the way back and some additional detail to kind of pull your eye through the space. Here's another example, stacking. Again, this area was in the kind of underneath of a giant zeppelin near a jail. And so there was no detail yet, but I just did this draw over and we wanted to set the mood a little bit about being near jail, so we had a lot of hanging wires and red lights and used the pipes to kind of frame the direction you were going. Very quick stuff. Here's another example. This was an early shot in stacking of the area where the player would get rewards as they progressed through the game. And I did a draw over to show how it all fit together. And this is where we'd like paint murals, and you'd get puzzle pieces for the puzzles you solved. And we sort of themed each of these little trophy stages according to the level. All right. So another thing that I think is a really great tip for doing quick visual development is to focus on mood over detail. If you look at how a lot of artists will approach both 2D and 3D games, is they'll start by spending a lot of time on detail in the game. And the problem is with that is, if you make a game with a lot of detail and no mood, no one's going to remember it. But if you do the opposite, if it has mood and no detail, it still has most of the impact. And the other great thing about this is that mood is fast and detail is not. And the way I like to achieve mood visually in games is by using lighting, an atmosphere or fog, and simple post effects or simple particle effects, nothing fancy. So I'm going to show you guys that. I built this really simple 3D mesh. It's all cubes, right? It's about as ugly as you can get. And the figure in the lower right is basically a scale reference for what a human would be. Now, with just like 5 minutes of lighting work, I don't have a mood yet. I'm going to have to switch. I'm going to switch to, yeah. Sorry, guys. Intermission.
We should get Tim to dance for us. Where's Tim Schafer? Hola, hola, hola. Okay.
Hello. All right. Thanks, everyone. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, this is a very simple level constructed just from boxes, and I just had a few minutes of lighting work on this. And this isn't complex lighting. It's a single directional light with shadows and a couple of point lights. Every engine on the planet can do this. And if you're doing this in 2D, it's just in thinking in terms of lighting when you're painting instead of detail. Now, if I spend a little more time on the image and add a little atmospheric perspective, which is usually called fog in most engines, if you're a painter, it's called atmospheric perspective, I now have a much better sense of foreground, background, and midground. And again, the time investment at this point isn't very much at all. If I spend a little more time on this, I now have just a few particle effects to get a sense of atmosphere. And now I think maybe it feels like we're in a real space, even though we have zero detail in the environment. It feels like maybe I'm emerging from a cave into some cool open air space, maybe a little ominous. And if we don't like that, we can change the fill just by changing the lighting. Now we have a more direct outdoor space with just sort of orange dusty particles and blue light from the sky. And if this isn't right, we can change it again just by making it seem nighttime. All we've done here is added a few spotlights that are warm in the foreground pointing up, like they do when you light buildings at night. And I created some very simple planes in the background to make the appearance of glowing windows. And all these changes are just a few minutes, and I think have a much better mood than if I had made a really detailed model that didn't have much going on lighting-wise. So they always say follow the fun in video game design, and I say follow the beauty in art design, which is the idea that you shouldn't strictly follow your initial concept art in most cases. Sometimes that's necessary for a variety of reasons, but if you're trying to make something new and you're in this prototype phase, pay attention to what's working in the game and go after that. Don't keep looking at your original concepts and go, isn't this an awesome concept? Because a pretty illustration doesn't make a great looking game most of the time, actually, as it turns out, in my opinion. So you have to actually let the game inform where you're going. I'm going to give you an example in stacking. When we started with stacking, there's an early image from the game. I knew I wanted to put these human scale objects into the game. I showed you some of the influence for that. And so in this scene, we had marbles as lights, and there's some map pins on the wall. And I told the artist I was working with that I wanted this to be like an abandoned rail station. And so instead of putting old papers and stuff that on the walls, he put human scale like tickets and playing cards and put them down on the ground. And everyone responded to that really well. They're like, this is amazing. And my original idea was only that these would be very small hidden things for players to find. And it worked so well, most players that we tested the game on, that we started adding it more. And so this potted plant became olives and toothpicks and a champagne cork. And it's supposed to be trapped in the kitchen, so we have them on a spices adjoining him. We had a recreation room, and the actual recreation room, the characters are standing on a giant pool table with dominoes, that same giant size. And what we found by adding these things is richer and deeper, because players would miss these things on the first time, but once they realized they were kind of looking for them, and it made them pay attention to all the detail in the environment more. So we had a lot of comments that the environment seemed very detailed and thoughtful, but we made this entire game in 10 months with a relatively small team, so there wasn't that much detail. It just grabbed the player's attention when it needed to. All right, the not fun part of developing a new look is to be critical of your own work. So it's really important that you guys take the time and evaluate the look of the game and invite others that you're working with to do the same. You need to see if all these elements are working together, because when you put all these things together, you go from single attractive things to rich dynamics of all these visuals mixed together. If they're not working, you got to spend the time to try and prioritize the stuff that's most important and make it work. So the way I approach it is I have a set of questions that I like to ask myself about the look, and I'll share those with you guys. So first and foremost for me is there good readability? Is what the player is supposed to be looking at clear? And although the games often have more going on than the simple foreground, background, and midground, I still think that most games, 2D or 3D, really want at least those three planes to work. It just almost always works to see your game in those three planes and make sure there's different detail at those planes. And also make sure that there's visual interest at different scales. The eye gets bored if everything is at human scale or everything is giant scale. It's something we learned on Brutal Legend, by the way, because we had all these giant things in the world and it was cool for 5 minutes, but then people didn't feel like they're in a real space. So we had to add lots of human scale detail. So let me give you an example. This is autonomous again, and it's a pretty noisy look. I took this screenshot at a random place in the game. This isn't a composed shot of a specific composition. But in this shot, you can see there's clearly a foreground. The player's hands advance towards the camera and stay there because they're darker, higher contrast shapes and glowing red right there in front of you. And you can get right up next to these elements, so oftentimes you have something of kind of medium size near the player, and that also acts as a nice framing device. And in the midground, there's a variety of scales of detail. We have the rubble piles, which provide like smaller human scale interest, and we have slightly bigger shapes, kind of car or truck size shapes. And then you usually see the red at that middle distance, because that's what you're going after. You're going after that energy. And by keeping it in the midground, it usually stays in the midground, because by the time you get up close to it, you capture it and it goes away. And in the very distance, we have our largest shapes. We have these big pyramidal shapes back there, a little subtle wireframe in the sky, and we keep everything pushed really far back with cyan and color and atmosphere. This is kind of a tricky one, but you can make a really pretty looking game that doesn't have anything to do with the rest of your game. You can make something beautiful, but if the art by itself is not communicating the same story or same ideas as your game mechanics, gameplay, or a specific narrative that your game has, it's not really working. It may be beautiful, but who cares? And so stacking is a game that is about finding, mechanically, you need to find the doll one size larger and stack into them. So you're always, doll size is of paramount importance to the player as they're looking to stack into these dolls. But if you look closely, what you find is that all the small dolls in the game are these poor children having to do these terrible jobs, or the lower working class people having to do these terrible jobs. And all of the large dolls are these like evil industrialist dolls. So we're reinforcing some of our themes of class and society with the mechanics the players are already paying attention to. And we extend that to the environment as well, everywhere. So you see here we have a set of benches in the train station, but they're segregated by doll size. So we've got the small dolls sitting on the tiny little bench, and we've got the big dolls with the better view sitting on the larger bench. That's true even in bars. Right? We've got the poor small guys got a drink on the lower rung of the table, while the big dolls spill their drinks on top of their head. And, you know, even in the bathrooms, right? So if you're the big guy, you get the big toilet, you get to overlook everyone else. All right. So I also like to think about how these elements harmonize with one another, and this is kind of a broad topic because I think we could probably spend a whole hour talking about why things don't harmonize with each other. But there's a couple things I see over and over again in games, and you know, one way to look at it is, do you feel like your objects feel like part of their world, or they were just dropped in with a level editor or pasted in by a prop artist or something? And I think that areas you see that most are what I call intersections and color combinations. So intersection is simply just whenever two things, typically the wall and the ground, kind of intersect one another. And that intersection, if you were a painter, you'd be doing all sorts of interesting things with that intersection. You'd be softening the edge or hardening the edge, doing something neat with color. If it was a really realistic lighting model, you'd have all sorts of irradiance and other stuff going on there. But you don't get those in most games. So if we look here in Autonomous, it's a very geometric feeling game with a lot of rigidity. But if you look, almost always when the wall intersects the ground, we have rubble piles. And what that actually does is it softens the game visually. Even though it's a very hard shape, you're not staring at this unnatural edge. Now, of course, not every game is a destroyed city. But if you look at stacking, for example, we also have another wall and floor intersecting one another right there. But what we did is we put a decorative trim there, and so it makes that edge seem intentional, not accidental. And just a word about color as well. So here's some terrible color scheme. Now, you may have a game where this color scheme is important and it works, so it's not universally bad. No color scheme is universally bad. But I took that early test scene and I just put some really bright blue, yellow, and red on there. And they don't harmonize at all, right? Because there's not any advanced lighting or anything clever going on here. But with just a little bit of color correction, you still have a very distinct red, blue, and yellow, but you have a sense of space, and things have kind of been glazed together. And in most places, you can do a simple post effect or lighting. If necessary. So you also need to ask yourself, how is this going to work for the whole game? Players get tired of looking at the same thing over and over, even if it's like it all connects to one another. But the problem with that is if you do that, it feels too uniform. And so I always say to aim for unity, not uniformity. And I just have a couple of screenshots here of stacking, just to show you that and these are only a few of the environments, but we have a pretty broad range of color palettes. We have closed interior spaces. We have big open exterior spaces. We have big interior spaces. We have candy-colored, maniacal hobo places. We have all sorts of crazy stuff. But I think if you played the game, it does still feel very much like the same world. So just to summarize my approach is start with inspirational lists and organized reference. Take the time to pull some reference, read a few things, and organize it, especially if you're working with a team and not just by yourself. Create concept art. It is still, I think, one of the best ways to get started, but don't stay too long in that mode. Just use it to see how everything is working together initially and move forward. Because really, you need to get in the game as fast as possible, because you're going to make so many different artistic choices when you see what it is like to move through a space or animate your character or interact with whatever it is in your game. And from that point, do paint-overs. And don't be the only one. If you're the art director, don't be the only one who does paint-overs. Have your whole art team do paint-overs, even artists who don't draw a lot. They're not hard. You learn a lot from them. They'll learn a lot from them. And they're really helpful. And mood first, details later. If your game doesn't have any emotion or doesn't have anything to say on that level, no one's going to care how much detail there is. And then follow the beauty. Once you're in the game and you see what's working, just go for it. Don't worry too much about your initial ideas. No ideas are that precious. Just go after new ones. And lastly, just make sure you always evaluate, have a critical eye in your own work, and you encourage other people to offer you feedback and refine what's not working. Well, thanks for your time, everyone, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there's time for it. So, thanks.
Bueno, los que quieran preguntar en inglés, pregunten en inglés, los que se animen, y los que no, pregunten en español y trato de traducirlo lo posible.
pero tienen que seguir viniendo para acá. ¿Nadie tiene ninguna pregunta? Ahí va. Esa.
When you start looking at the details, where do you start from? The foreground, middle ground, or the background?
So I think in most games, and this is true in most visual design, the midground is usually your focal point. And the foreground is just there to kind of draw your eye towards the midground. And the background is just there to give you a sense of world. So I think the midground is usually what most players are interacting with. It varies per game, of course, but that's the area that you want to be focusing the most energy on.
Hi. Thank you very much for the talk first. It was very well structured and very enjoyable.
Thank you.
I noticed something, or at least I guess it's a personal opinion, but you talked a lot about doing something akin to rapid prototyping, and I feel that kind of thing usually works best with people with more technical experience, whether that is in art or in programming, because usually with more technical experience comes the ability to decide, this gives me more payoff. This little bit of work really gives me a lot of payoff to know what it works or what doesn't. And considering a lot of people here are interested in the independent scene or might be hobbyists, what do you think, or what has been your personal journey in trying to get there, trying to get to a place where you know, I'm not going to do all these details because it's not going to pay off, I'm going to focus on this. Maybe your experience, maybe share some of that?
Yeah, I guess the way I look at it is that I think it's important to understand your medium. And video games are the medium that I'm working in, So I don't think that's so much the idea of being technical as much as just understanding what it is to make a game. I wouldn't expect a painter to not know how to mix paint. I expect every video game artist to understand what games are. And I think that's the important part is, of course, you have a mix of skills on every team you work on. So it takes brilliant programmers to make all this happen. But I don't think I would insist that artists have to script or have a deep knowledge of shaders. It's nice to have a mix of people with different backgrounds so you get multiple viewpoints on every game.
Si alguien quiere hacer la pregunta en español, la vamos a poder traducir. No se preocupen, pueden venir a preguntar lo que quieran. Hay tiempo para esto.
Hi, as an art director, would you work closely with, for example, musicians, artists, change your own view of the game because of opinions from the other teams? Especially, for example, the musicians on a game.
Yeah, I love working with the audio guys, and it's funny because in most studios, the audio guys are kind of banished off to some corner or a separate room because they need all that sound equipment and a soundproof room. But since I think it's great in a short time period to set your mood first, there's no better way to do that than with music and sound design. And so I try to involve, whenever possible, the audio guys as early as possible. And I don't know that much about sound and music, and it's always great to hear their take and what their read on the ideas of the game are and have influence. Stacking was I got to work really closely with a bunch of musicians on that, and music and the sound of that game was a big important part of the feel of that game.
There is water here. Hi, thanks for the talk, it was great. I wanted to ask you, because you said that this was for 3D, if you have something to say about 2D art, or the same things apply, but what are the differences?
Yeah, so I think most of the same principles they're identical, really. The difference with most of the 2D projects that I've worked on is that you usually have a little more control over the composition. So it actually makes these things a little easier. With 3D games, one of the biggest tricks is that there's very rarely a static composition. So a lot of the very traditional methods for pulling the player's eye around, like you would learn as a painter, are hard to adapt. But like in Broken Age, for example, we follow a similar process. We have a very rough layout for the space, and Bagel, one of the painters on the thing, does what we call a color rough, which is getting the colors in early before the detail, because it gives you a sense of space and it sets the mood, and there's a lot more, you get more reactions and feedback at that stage. So these are the same ideas I use pretty much for most games I work on.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hello.
I wanted to ask you, well, my voice sounds very weird through a speaker system, about how you manage or how you control a team of 10 in 2 weeks to make something out of it, because I think it's a bit chaotic, you know, and if they are not like top-notch experienced developers, I think it's going to be a problem. So what's your take on that?
That's a good question. Yeah, you know, I think when you're in a 2-week game jam, it's probably different than maybe how you'd structure it in a project, a full, long project, because it is a certain amount of chaos with that. I guess what I try and do more than anything else is just I communicate a lot. I guess I always have 2 pieces of advice if you're managing a game or working on a game, and they're really simple. There's nothing too astounding here, but I would say play your game every day, and I know that sounds crazy, but you get really, really busy, especially on larger projects, and it's really hard to play the game. So you should play it every day, and also over-communicate to your team. And in a game jam, like when we do Amnesia Fortnite, you know, we're all sitting together, and I sort of always see my role as to kind of help glue things together. So I have to have a deep understanding of what everyone's working on, giving them feedback as quick as possible. I'm not afraid to make decisions. You have to make decisions. They're not always the right decisions. It doesn't matter. Not making a decision is making a decision. It's just making a bad one. So, you know, I don't really have anything other than just, you know, work with the people directly, be respectful and honest, but tell them exactly when something's not working and invite their feedback as well.
Hi, Lee.
Hello.
You've done all the things in the game industry, I mean, like modeling and design and like concept art and like almost every step of the way a game gets all like done, you know. And what do you feel is the most rewarding thing, like content creation or more high-level design, or like I mean, more in the macro sense or in the micro sense? What do you feel personally is like more rewarding from the game?
That's a good question. I mean, I've sort of always been, maybe, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your opinion, kind of a jack of all trades. And that means I like to do a lot of different things. So it's hard for me to answer that question, but there is something pretty amazing about being able, given the chance, to have an idea and work with a group of people to make it realized. That's a pretty magical thing. And you know, I was, thanks to Tim and Amnesia Fortnite, I got to do that for stacking, you know, from the start, and that was a really great experience for me. But I also, as an artist, sometimes if you're jumping around a lot, you can feel like, ah, man, I really just want to get my hands dirtier, and I want to get deeper into this and make something of substance. So regardless of what project I'm working on, I'm always trying to find a way to just keep myself directly involved with the work. Most art directors I know who've spent too long not directly making something, I think they become irrelevant. I hate to say it, you know, except for maybe on like really, really large projects. I think they kind of forget what it is to make the stuff and have very specific feedback and understand just the nature of games, you know? So I would just always try and stay busy. Yeah.
Hey Lee, I have a question.
Oh no!
So, you know, when making art design choices for a game, a sort of conflict can arise because you're trying to solve 2 problems at a time. One is communicating effectively with the players, who are already playing the game, who are already into the game. But at the same time, you want to look sexy to get new players, or to seduce publishers, or to look nice in screenshots, or for having something for the press to talk about. So when there are no more compromises to make, when you have to make the choice, how does Double Fine solve that kind of conflicts?
That's when we call in Tim, the Slayer. He lays down the law. I don't know, you know, I guess I've been in the game industry for almost 20 years, and I really feel like I've never been in a situation where I haven't been able to work something out. Sometimes, if I'm in a position of, you know, making the call, people aren't always going to be happy. But I always explain my reasoning, And I'm always open to, if it's not working, it's not working. It's like everything else in design, you got to iterate on it. I think trying to keep everyone focused on the end product and the medium as the game, as opposed to, well, these are artists being artists, and these are designers being designers, that we're all collaborating, because from a player's perspective, they don't mentally divide art from mechanics, from story. It's just kind of an experience. So I think there are multiple ways. If the art solution is too much, then to try and come up with a different one.
Hi.
Hello.
You said that a game designer has to use as reference more than just games, other kinds of art. Do you think that it's helpful for an artist, art director, or a game designer to dabble himself in other kinds of art too?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's always good to have experience outside games, I think that's unquestionable in other medium. You don't expect guys to make movies just to watch movies all day. They do other things. For me, I actually like, I love making games. I love making art for games, but it's nice to sometimes do something completely different, go back to painting on canvas. And most of the time I swear because there's no undo button, I'm like, oh, this is so hard, mixing colors sucks. But it's great because it makes you reframe some of your assumptions and makes you, you get into the habit over time of I make shapes that look this way, or I make colors that look this way. But changing mediums up and the process is a little different, kind of gets you out of that sometimes. So I try to always do different things when I have the time.
Ok, tenemos un poco de tiempo más para una pregunta. Realmente no hay pregunta muy inicial. Pueden animarse a preguntar lo que quieran. Vengan para acá.
Hi.
Hello.
I've been wondering about the game Stalking. The whole concept of the game, where did it came from? I mean, both artistically and the gameplay. Where did it came up? I mean, you step on a matryoshka one day and you said, God damn it, I'm gonna make a game out of you, and I swear for God, I'm gonna make you die 10 times. Every player in the single world is gonna make you feel what I feel, something like that.
Yeah, I'm, well, I can tell you some things. I'm really bad about answering where ideas come from. The truth is I have no idea. I just have an idea one day, but I can sort of I kind of go back and do archaeological excavations about things I'm interested in and figure out probably where it came from. And I know that I had been talking to Tim about, I think I was actually talking to him originally about I want to do this German expressionist game. It's all black and white. And then Limbo came out and I was like, fuck that. We're not doing that. But the original game had all these different masks that you'd put on to change your identity to get through this weird theatrical world. And so I think that some of those ideas were kind of still around. And I guess I'm always interested in games about identity. And I don't know where, I think my daughter had some stacking dolls she was playing with one day. And I was like, oh, that'd be really cool. And well, what would it mean to be one of those? What type of world would they live in? I just sort of that initial question, I started imagining all that. And working at Double Fine, I'd never really worked on an adventure game. And really under the hood, stacking is kind of an adventure game, right? And so I thought, well, it'd be cool what if we could do an adventure game that was kind of a little more system-based, where we had multiple solutions and there's kind of stuff to do outside just the puzzles, and they're all part of this world, and captured some of the things I really liked about adventure games, like exploring things at your own pace and not being shot in the face by people with guns, So, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much where all those ideas came from.
Okay, thank you, Lee.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.